"Tom, why are you home?" Lisa, my wife of 28 years, asked as she came in through the garage and saw me sitting at the kitchen table, less than 10 feet away. Her body partially blocked the tall, younger man who followed her into our house. Lisa, always beautiful, stands at 5 feet 9 inches, weighing a healthy 145 pounds, her auburn hair falling over her shoulders. She always dresses professionally for work, and today, in a white B-Marks with an extra button undone, she revealed some enticing cleavage between her spectacular 38D chest. A black linen skirt highlighted her world-class legs, and 3-inch heels perfectly shaped her backside. Briefly considering Lisa's foolish question, I responded, "I live here." A flash of irritation, something I'd seen more of in recent weeks, crossed her face as she asked why I was home at 3:30 in the afternoon. I always joke with anyone who'll listen that I've loved Lisa since the day we met. I met her when she was the administrative assistant for 4 top executives at her company, and she escorted me to the senior suite for hours of meetings. Taking a chance, I asked her out to dinner as she walked me back to the lobby, and the rest is history. By now, Liz's companion had maneuvered around her and stood at her side. Expecting a smirk, I was surprised to see concern in his eyes. Clearly, things weren't going as planned. I asked Liz why she was home an hour and a half earlier than expected. "Lisa and I have been inseparable since our first date. I dedicated all my energy to her and our family, building a successful insurance brokerage firm. With the help of her employer, Lisa earned a bachelor's degree in 6 years, progressing from a support role to leading HR in the company's Hartford, Connecticut, office. Having loved Lisa unconditionally for nearly 3 decades, I now faced the transformation she'd undergone with determined calmness. Wanting to break her just as she had broken me, I gave Liz my signature crooked grin. She responded, "We came home early to talk with you." I questioned Liz about her use of "we," locking eyes with her. Her companion then introduced himself confidently as David Price, the new attorney at Kellerman & Sons, and said he'd been working closely with Ong for the past couple of months. Despite his outstretched hand, which I ignored, and while keeping eye contact with Liz, I chose not to react violently. Instead, I growled and asserted that I knew exactly who and what he was. For the first time, I noticed concern in my wife's expression, and she winced when I mentioned Ong. "You once threatened severe consequences for anyone who called you Ong. Why tolerate such disrespect in your own home from this guy?" I asked, pointing in his direction. Liz, who is typically worried and confused, is a Medica Marks planner. I knew she and Mofo had Medica Marksly planned every possible scenario for this conversation. She saw me as the compliant, betrayed husband. A quick glance at Mofo brought a smile to my face, and I was fairly certain his nerves were as tight as mine. A storm was brewing, one Liz and her companion hadn't anticipated. Taking a few deep breaths, I tried to push aside the growing rage and disgust. Internally, I decided it was time to disrupt their plans again. I suggested we make 3 drinks and talk in the living room. Liz asked for a glass of wine. When I turned to the other person, he looked wary but mentioned Lisa had told him about my liking for bourbon and craft beer. I nodded as I rose from the kitchen table and headed toward the family room's bar. As I left, I heard their urgent whispering as they moved into the living room. A few minutes later, I joined them. They sat together on the sofa. I handed Liz her favorite Merlot and Mofo a tulip glass of Ambrale. I settled into an armchair across from them. After raising my glass in a mock toast, I took a sip of the fiery liquid. Mofo returned the gesture, sipping his beer, commenting on its complexity, and asking about its identity. I told him it was Pabst Blue Ribbon. At the mention of the beer, Mofo's eyes flared with anger, and Liz, looking confused, reminded me that I had once said Pabst Blue Ribbon was worse than donkey urine and the worst beer ever made. She was midway through her comment when she noticed I was laughing. Annoyed, she said I was being rude and condescending during what was supposed to be a calm conversation. I smiled and questioned her accusation, suggesting we needed to kickstart the conversation properly. I expected to learn how to have a polite, uplifting, and loving discussion from my wife. Liz cringed and avoided eye contact. S. White took over, starting to speak. I interrupted him, pointing out how he initially called me Mr. Bradley but then switched presumptuously to Tom. I insisted he address me as Mr. Bradley. His face reddened, and I shrugged, suggesting he could call me sir instead. I turned to Liz and asked, with heat, what she wanted to discuss. When S. White seemed ready to speak, I cut him off, informing him I was addressing my wife and told him to sit there, drink his complex amber ale and stay quiet. Liz, furious, let me know how much my behavior that afternoon bothered her, insisting that it had to stop. I nodded, as if considering what she said, and asked her if my behavior was any worse than hers had been over the past 5 or 6 weeks. Liz looked a bit confused and worried, asking what I meant. Mofo seemed to hold his breath, probably thinking that their carefully laid-out plan was starting to unravel. Looking directly at Liz, I told her I was disturbed, admitting I wasn't sure what bothered me more, her cheating or treating me like I was an idiot. The look on Lisa's face showed her shock. Her eyes narrowed, and in a low voice, she said she had more friends at my office than I did. She said she'd received an anonymous email 2 weeks ago, accusing me of having an affair. The email had 3 attachments, showing me at Middlewoods Park, holding hands and kissing someone during a picnic lunch. She apologized for how she found out and was about to continue when I cut her off, asking if she wanted a divorce. She said no and scooted forward on the couch, leaning in with her elbows on her knees, saying passionately that she loved me. She explained that her involvement with David was just a fling, saying he was new to Connecticut and hadn't made many friends. She expected he'd find a steady girlfriend once he got settled. Apologizing, she admitted the situation wasn't right for her because she'd signed up for a monogamous marriage, and said that she thought divorce would be better suited for her future plans. Still, she begged me to stop, insisting she didn't want a divorce and suggesting I probably felt the same. She emphasized that her fling with David was just that, a brief fling, saying it happened because she was attracted to him and wanted a bit of extra excitement in her life. She promised it had never happened before and wouldn't happen again. I took a sip of my bourbon and stayed quiet for a few moments before responding. I pointed out that her promises meant nothing and said that everyone in the room knew she was lying. Expecting a reaction from Lisa, I pressed on, asking why I should believe this was her first affair and not her 51st. I reminded her of all the work we'd put into building a family, pointing out that now, with Amy married and thinking about starting her own family, we could finally slow down and plan for a peaceful retirement. I told her I believed that in a few years her fling with David would be long forgotten. Then I stood up and, without asking if anyone wanted another drink, went to the din to refill my glass. I was sure my lack of courtesy didn't go unnoticed by the two of them sitting in the living room. When I came back, I saw them huddled together, whispering. Mofo asked if he could say a few things. I gave him the floor with a disgusted reply. After gathering his thoughts, he admitted that Lisa was right. What they had was just a short-term fling. He said he regretted getting involved with a married woman and claimed he'd never done something like this before. He acknowledged their connection, complimenting Lisa's amazing qualities. He mentioned my talk of divorce in the heat of the moment, but warned against it, noting how much time Lisa and I had spent together and advising me not to throw it away. He also mentioned Lisa's concerns about the prenuptial agreement, hinting that it might be vulnerable due to its age and changes in the law. He claimed the lack of proof of infidelity weakened its enforceability. As I listened to him wrap up his legal speech, I couldn't help but wonder how my wife had become so misguided. I turned to Lisa and said I couldn't understand why she would seek legal advice from a corporate attorney who graduated in the bottom quarter of his class at Texas Southern University, one of the worst law schools in the country. I asked how she didn't know S. White hadn't finished, explaining that knowing one's enemy is one of my mottos. I then redirected my attention back to Lisa, asking what her plan was going forward. After a moment of thought, she revealed that she and David were spending the weekend together. She detailed their itinerary, saying she'd be staying at his apartment that night and they'd head to New York City the next day. They planned to stay there Friday and Saturday nights, with her returning on Sunday. Even though I already knew their plans, the boldness of her admission still hurt. I told her how disappointed I was, hoping she could see the sadness in my eyes. I mentioned how much it tarnished our tradition of quarterly getaways to New York City, which had been filled with unforgettable sights, award-winning Broadway plays, concerts, and sporting events. I shared how it saddened me that those memories would be tainted now and expressed my concern over how much Lisa had changed. Lisa, sensing my devastation, reacted accordingly, but I was too lost in the thoughts running through my head, urging me to end things. I turned to a now concerned mofo and asked him how his wife felt about his involvement with mine. Lisa quickly jumped in, telling me to stop, explaining that David was a widower and that his wife had died several years ago. Even Mofo seemed uncomfortable, cringing at her words. I smirked and commented to Lisa about the difference between her and David. Without pausing, I asked her when she had become a widow, and David hesitantly confirmed it. I reached down and grabbed a manila folder from the backpack beside my chair. After opening it and scanning the first page, I revealed some details about David's late wife, Dr. Rachel Price. She had been an emergency department surgeon at Ascension St. Mike's Hospital in Detroit. She had a husband, David, and 2 daughters, Sarah and Emily. The document mentioned her resignation and relocation to Hartford, Connecticut to join her husband as soon as their children finished school. Despite my dissatisfaction with my marriage, I found it hard not to enjoy the look of shock on Lisa's face. Lisa confronted me, asking if I had lied to her. I couldn't hold back my laughter, amused by the irony of a liar and a cheat accusing each other of dishonesty. David reached out, cupping Lisa's hand. Just before I could react, feeling the anger rise inside me, I realized something disturbing. I didn't have the energy to care anymore. Lisa's lover, Ong, began apologizing, admitting to his deceit and expressing his desire for her. It was sickening to hear. He stood there holding her hand, discussing their future together as if I wasn't even in the room. Lisa, after a moment of hesitation, took his hand and turned to me, promising she'd end things with David and return to being the devoted wife she claimed to be. As they continued to talk, my heart sank further. It felt like watching everything I had built crumble before my eyes. Finally, I mustered up the strength to speak. I asked for their attention, insisting I be allowed to share my thoughts and feelings in the midst of their betrayal. They exchanged uneasy glances, unsure how to react to my request for fairness. After a moment of reluctance, they agreed to sit down and listen. With the skill I'd developed during the pandemic, I quickly set up a few Zoom meetings. As the TV screen flickered to life, I addressed Peter and Mark, asking if they could hear me. Once the introductions were made, Lisa and her companion were shocked to learn that Mark, Mike's son, my new divorce attorney, and David Price, a corporate attorney, were now involved. Mark wasted no time laying out the situation. Addressing Lisa as Mrs. Bradley, he explained that he was representing me in our impending divorce, and papers had already been filed. He gave her a deadline to find her own attorney and warned her about the consequences of failing to comply. Mark explained that infidelity was cited as the reason for divorce, with supporting evidence from a private investigator documenting her affair with Mr. Price. Their shock was obvious as reality began to sink in. When Mark finished, I placed another manila folder on the coffee table in front of Liz, making a marked thud that startled them both. I informed them that inside was a copy of our divorce petition and the investigator's report. As Price reached for the folder, Liz glanced back at the screen. I explained our plan to enforce the prenuptial agreement, which had been updated every 2 years for the past 28 years, with her signed and notarized agreement on each update. I then explained that the board of directors at Bradley Brokerage had voted the previous night to relieve Liz of all corporate duties and sever all ties between her and my firm. I laid out the timeline for returning the company car, canceling the company credit cards and cell phone, and terminating her memberships to various clubs. I also mentioned the cancellation of joint credit cards and the freezing of joint financial accounts, all in line with the prenuptial agreement. We then requested an 80-20 split of assets in my favor, including full ownership of the house. Liz would have 30 days to move out and take her belongings. I noted there would be no alimony or child support, and any other claims would be explained by her lawyer. Mark asked if anything had been missed, and I replied that he had covered everything, thanking him for his thoroughness. As the screen went black, Liz jumped up, exclaiming that they should wait. She asked me to bring the attorneys back as she had questions. I told her that wasn't how it worked. She would have to hire her own lawyer to get her answers. Frustrated, she threatened to destroy me. I smirked and turned to her companion, asking for his legal opinion on how this would affect the divorce. He didn't respond, and Liz slumped back into the couch, visibly shaken. I smiled and waved the TV remote at her before pointing it back at the screen. As the second Zoom meeting started, I addressed Brian, asking if he could hear me. He acknowledged, saying he had a conference call soon and needed to make it quick. He informed Price that he was fired and that his personal items were being packed up and left in the lobby for him to pick up within 24 hours, after which they would be discarded. Brian also mentioned there would be no recommendation offered to Lisa. I could sense Liz's growing fear as her boss slowed his speech and sighed, clearly disappointed. He acknowledged her 29 years of service, despite his deep disappointment in her actions. However, he announced that her position in Hartford had been eliminated and offered her a similar role at their Albany, New York facility. He gave her a week to decide on the transfer and 30 days to complete the relocation. The screen went blank again, leaving Liz in tears, while her companion S-marched on the couch. I smirked at Mofo. When he noticed, his anger started to build. He was younger, bigger, and probably stronger. But unfortunately for him, he was as dumb as a sack of rocks. Just as Mofo was about to explode, I once again waved the remote, pointed it at the TV, and pressed a button. The screen lit up, and I asked, "Dr. Price, can you hear me?" Mofo and Liz sat there in stunned silence, white as ghosts, mouths hanging open. The face of a beautiful blonde woman appeared on the screen. Rachel addressed David, telling him she had filed for divorce and that he should expect to be served soon. She stated her intention to stay in Michigan with their children and mentioned that she had managed to keep her job at the hospital. David pleaded with her to reconsider, insisting they could work things out and claiming his affair was just a fling. The disgust on Rachel's face was clear. She dropped a bombshell, revealing that David had lost multiple jobs due to his repeated infidelities. Following a prompt from me, she had conducted her own investigation, uncovering David's affairs with several of Liz's associates. Liz stayed silent as Rachel rattled off their names, then laughed at the idea that David deserved an explanation. She told him he wasn't welcome in her home and asked for his address to send his belongings. As the screen faded to black, David threatened me, sending a surge of adrenaline through my veins. Without hesitation, I reached for my Colt .45, aiming it directly at him. The sight of the gun made David stagger, but I didn't flinch. I gave him a choice: leave or stay quiet. His silence was the only acceptable response, and, thankfully, he complied. Turning back to the screen, I saw Liz's tear-streaked face, her anguish plain as day. It was a gut-wrenching sight that stirred both empathy and resolve within me. Liz revealed that she had been seeing a counselor for the past 2 weeks, then groaned and began crying. She expressed frustration, noting the irony that, despite her actions, she was the one seeking mental health support. I laughed, acknowledging the absurdity of it all. Later, I reminded Lisa of an insightful question Dr. Clark had asked during one of our counseling sessions. She asked if I understood the saying, "Love is blind," and it struck a chord with me. I reflected on how my love for Liz had blinded me to her flaws, even to the point of ignoring her infidelity. Despite everything, I told her I still loved her deeply, and I doubted she would ever find someone who loved her as much as I did. Liz, still clearly upset, said she intended to keep seeing Dr. Clark, emphasizing how important it was to have someone she could trust to talk to, especially after everything that had happened. She said she couldn't believe the extent of the humiliation and disrespect she had experienced from someone she had loved so much. Still, she was determined to move past the hurt and move on with her life. Liz mentioned talking to Dr. Clark about her plans for the day, admitting that the counselor had advised against seeking revenge but had approved of the first 3 Zoom meetings as a form of payback. However, Dr. Clark had warned against the 4th meeting, fearing it could harm Liz's recovery due to the emotional damage it might cause. I thought about it, and while I agreed that Dr. Clark was probably right, I didn't care. This meeting would hurt me, but it would devastate her. I held up the remote for the fourth time and waved it at Liz, who shrank back into the couch. Panicking, I pointed it at the TV and pressed the button. All eyes were glued to the screen, and when the face appeared, Liz murmured in distress. My daughter, Amy, appeared on the screen, expressing her love for me. I responded in kind, but Liz cried out, asking how I could treat her so poorly. Amy cut in, revealing that she had overheard Liz's conversations with her boyfriend and knew all about their actions and plans. She expressed her disappointment and disgust, calling Liz's behavior grotesque and pathetic. Liz tried to justify herself, but Amy stood firm, telling her that her actions were selfish and self-centered. Liz then expressed her deep loneliness to Amy, saying how much she missed her since she moved away. Amy, looking puzzled, asked if Liz was blaming her for her problems. Liz denied it, saying that wasn't what she meant. Liz pleaded to come to Boston and talk, but Amy shut it down, reminding her that she already had plans with her new boyfriend near Cape Cod. Then, Amy dropped another bombshell. She was pregnant. She said she wanted to celebrate with people who brought joy and love into her life, not the negativity that Liz had brought into hers. Liz, trying to assert her authority, demanded an invitation, but Amy firmly refused, insisting on keeping her celebration free from the turmoil Liz represented. For the fourth time, the screen went dark, leaving Liz visibly upset. I stood up and discreetly tucked the pistol into the back of my pants. I announced that I was going out for dinner and would be back in 2 hours. I told Liz to pack her things and essentials, informing her that she would not be allowed back until the court responded to the divorce petition, which would take about a week. Turning to Mofo, I reminded him of my capabilities and gave him 3 days to leave the state, warning him that there would be severe consequences if he stayed past Monday. As I pulled open the front door, I glanced back at the defeated pair and casually mentioned how beautiful the upcoming weekend in New York was supposed to be. Second story. My name is Ben Turner, and I'm now 56 years old, standing 5 feet 8 inches tall and in decent shape. I've been married to Amy for 22 years, and I thought she was my life and soul partner. Amy is 45 with blonde hair, blue eyes, and standing at 5 feet 2 inches. She's built for lovemaking, and I cherished our intimate moments whenever we were alone, although sometimes she didn't seem interested in reciprocating. I spent 8 years in the Special Forces right after high school mastering explosives, followed by 6 years in engineering school. Afterward, I built my own multi-million-dollar construction business. Most people don't know about my military background because of the demons I've battled, which led to 4 years of counseling. I've also had a pilot's license since before my military days, but Amy never trusted me enough to join me for a flight. I fell in love with Amy the moment I met her, and 2 years later we were married. She comes from old money, her maiden name being Clark, descended from William Clark of the Mayflower. However, her family always looked at me like I was nothing more than a servant. Despite that, I spared no expense when it came to her, buying a large house in Cambridge, Massachusetts with a 4-car garage and a BMW. We have 2 kids, or rather, she has 2 kids, Mike, who's 21, and the 19-year-old, both of whom are in college. I bought them both new BMWs, while I still drive a 10-year-old GMC 4-wheel drive pickup. About 6 years ago, they started treating me badly, and it wasn't long before they revealed that they didn't see me as part of the family. They don't listen to me or care about what I say. They only listen to Amy, their mother. I even hired Mike 8 years ago, thinking he was my best friend, but the kids adored him more than they respected me. Then, about a year ago, Amy left her email open, and my curiosity got the better of me. I started reading through them, and to my disbelief, she admitted to hating me ever since we met. Her whole family shared the same feelings. But the most shocking revelation was that the kids weren't mine. They were Mike's. They'd known this for 6 years. Mike had known Amy before I even hired him, and it amused them to keep me in the dark. Mike and my supposed son, Sam, laughed at how clueless I was. When Amy and I married, her father insisted on a prenuptial agreement, which I signed. It expires in 2.5 years after our 25-year anniversary. There's an infidelity clause stating that whoever cheats leaves with nothing. A friend of mine from my military days, Steve, introduced me to James, who's an expert in surveillance. James set up a system where Amy's emails and even the kids' emails were forwarded to a private account of mine. I also had the house wired so I could hear phone calls and even had video recordings. Without Steve's intervention, my family could have ended up facing dire consequences. He convinced me not to resort to violence and instead suggested ways to hurt them emotionally, taking away their money, ruining their family name, and exposing their disgrace publicly. Mike and his friends mock me, fully aware of the prenup and Amy's affair. They're eagerly awaiting the moment when Tom, my former best friend, steps in to take over. I have video evidence of my father-in-law talking about creating the illusion that he funded my company. Their plan was for Mike to take over the business after the divorce, a scheme they had been working on for years. That's why Mike applied for a job at my company, pretending to be my closest ally. The only people I trust are my old military buddies, and I'm thankful I stayed in contact with them. I enlisted James as a computer consultant for my company, and he secured the network, helping me identify my allies and my enemies. This gave me about 1.5 years to prepare for an inevitable divorce. In the meantime, I played the role of a husband stuck in a strained marriage. I kept physical closeness with Amy only to keep up appearances, but I used it to emotionally hurt her. I made sure to initiate intimacy only when I knew she hadn't seen Mike. I'd often send Mike out of town on business trips without her catching on. Though I'm not innocent myself, I pretended to remain oblivious to Mike's true relationship with Amy. To humiliate her, I performed public displays of affection and secretly ran DNA tests that confirmed what I already knew. The children weren't mine. They were Mike's. Their elaborate scheme involved Mike taking over the business after the divorce to further exploit and humiliate me. To get ahead of their plan, I privately met with a competitor to sell my company at a reduced price. I trusted his honesty, even though we had been rivals. I explained why I was selling and swore him to secrecy, only informing a few trusted people, including our lawyers. The law firm I hired shared my disdain for my father-in-law, which was a big reason I chose them to represent me. They helped me set up a private bank account and phone account, and they even suggested that I convince Amy and the kids to lease their cars instead of buying new ones. It was an idea they loved because it meant annual upgrades for less money on my end. Quietly, I started packing my things and moving them into a rented storage unit. People laughed at me, whether behind my back or to my face. I even suggested to Amy that we start filing our taxes separately and transfer the house into her name for tax purposes. To make it happen, we'd need to take out a new mortgage in her name. Her whole family loved the idea, thinking it would make it easier for her to claim the house in the divorce. My new law firm also recommended transferring the house to Amy's name to protect my credit. Despite her desire for home improvements, including an in-ground pool, I allowed her to proceed, funded by a second mortgage in her name. Since the house was solely in her name now, the loans had to be in her name as well. Half of the funds went toward the upgrades she wanted, while the other half quietly funneled into my private account, completely unnoticed. I continued to manage all the bills, changing the beneficiaries of my insurance policies to direct funds to charities in case of my death. I sold my company without raising suspicion, ensuring the new owners retained all employees except Mike and his associates. Within a year, everything was in place for my exit. I proposed treating the entire family, including in-laws and my ex-best friend Mike, to a 2-week trip to Europe. They probably mocked the idea behind my back, but it served my purpose, especially since Amy was paying for it. I discreetly purchased 150 acres of land in Alaska, accessible only by plane, utilizing my long-held pilot's license. I had plans drawn up for an off-grid cabin on stilts, along with a plane shelter, hiring a company to build it with the goal of making it move-in ready. Realizing it would take some time for the cabin to be completed, I also bought a house with a large barn-style garage in Fairbanks, where I could store a motorhome and stay while I traveled. A military friend, who shared my dislike for my in-laws, agreed to register the motorhome in his name. Even though he was hesitant, I insisted on compensating him and my other friends for their help. From Amy's emails, they all believed I was still oblivious to everything. I stopped paying the mortgage on the house, their car payments, insurance, and utilities. Everything was in Amy's name now, so her credit would be the one to suffer, not mine. I set up a P.O. box in her name, where all the bills would be sent, keeping up the illusion that I was still handling the finances. Once the divorce was finalized, her credit would be ruined, and with no alimony due to my supposed unemployment, they'd have no clue I'd already sold the company. All the funds were safely hidden in an offshore account, making it appear as though I lost the company to the new owners. My plan was to disappear. Just before their trip, I told them there was an emergency at the company, so I couldn't join them right away. Their lack of concern and the relief on their faces when I said I wouldn't be going was obvious. The night before they left for Europe, I made sure Amy would remember me. We had one final, intense, intimate encounter, pushing boundaries that I'd never crossed before. She seemed pleased at first but ended up sore and angry. Too bad for Mike, who had been with her for years but never gave her the same experience. Once they left for Europe, I returned to the house, leaving it wide open. James came by to retrieve all the surveillance equipment, and I paid a moving company in cash to pack and transport my belongings to Alaska. I took only essentials, clothes, tools, fishing gear, and weapons from my military days, all securely stored. I left behind all the furniture, ensuring that no paperwork revealed any connection to Alaska. My son Mike had never shown interest in my trips for hunting or fishing, so he remained unaware of where I went. I kept my old phone account active to make Amy think I was still around, planning to close it a month after leaving. Before I left, I gave the phone to a colleague, instructing him not to answer calls from my wife but to use the number to make calls for a month. Before departing, I stopped by my in-laws' house with my keys, turned on all the lights, and posted an ad on a college website for a week-long kegger at their house. Knowing their frugal nature and favoritism toward Mike, I also closed all joint bank accounts and canceled the credit cards, racking up a total of $50,000 before I left. I sold my truck to a dealer and, 3 days later, departed for Alaska without revealing my destination. Monitoring everything through Amy's emails, I saw that no one, not my wife, kids, in-laws, or Mike, made any effort to check on me. They assumed I was handling everything, unaware that Amy had been footing the bill for all of it. I took my time crossing the country, paying for everything in cash. I drove to Bellingham, Washington, took the ferry to Valdez, Alaska, and then continued to Fairbanks, all without needing a passport. By the time I reached Washington, Amy and her family had returned from Europe, only to find their homes and properties wrecked. They were completely unaware that I had orchestrated everything. Surprisingly, they were more concerned with their destroyed homes than with the fact that I was missing. It was the police, not my so-called family, who finally started asking about me on Sunday, the day after they returned to the U.S. I granted my attorney power of attorney for my divorce and informed them I'd check in 2 weeks later, without giving any hint of where I was. On Monday morning, Amy received her infidelity divorce papers. While I wanted to sue Mike for alienation of affection, Massachusetts law prohibited it due to past lawsuits against state politicians. Nevertheless, Mike and his friends lost their jobs, just as I had arranged with the new owners. With all his belongings gone, it was a shame for him. Amy found herself drowning in debt, with more owed than she had in the bank. Creditors pursued her, the cars were repossessed, and the power and water were shut off. Both the property taxes and mortgages were overdue, forcing her and her spoiled children to move into her parents' hotel. Her parents had to rent cars for everyone. Mike, now unemployed, also had to move in with them, pleading with Amy's parents for a rental car. They transitioned from BMWs to far less impressive vehicles. Amy and her family hired private investigators to track me down, while her attorneys tried to delay the divorce, a futile effort. The case garnered public attention when DNA test results and explicit videos were leaked online. Audio recordings revealed the length of the affair, the family's involvement, and their plans to publicly ruin and humiliate me, seize control of my company, and their blatant disdain for the middle class. Videos and audio clips of her family bribing politicians and public officials, along with their mistreatment of honest people, were posted on various websites. The divorce was eventually finalized, The judge assigned to the case had to recuse himself after being exposed as one of the public officials the family had paid off. Though I reached out to the kids, they ignored me. 5 years later, during a visit to Boston to wrap up some old business, I went to a restaurant often frequented by her family. They walked past me without recognizing who I was. Now sporting long gray hair, a beard, and in better shape than ever, I had the waiter send a bottle of champagne to their table. The entire family looked like they had aged 20 years. They stared at me, puzzled, until Amy finally shouted, "Oh my God, you son of a Grimalkin!" She recognized me and told the rest of the family who I was. Mike tried to confront me, but with one punch, I knocked him out cold. When his son came at me, I subdued him too, but didn't go as far. Amy rushed over, screaming at me for ruining her family and hurling insults. The police arrived and arrested me. I asked the waiter to contact my lawyer, suspecting the police wouldn't let me. When they reviewed the surveillance footage, it clearly showed that I had been calm the entire time and acted in self-defense. They released me soon after, thanks to my lawyer's foresight in securing copies of the footage in advance. Had it not been for that, I doubt the police would have let me go, given their ties to my father-in-law. Later, Amy called my hotel, asking for a conversation. We met in the hotel lobby, where I made sure our conversation was recorded. She asked why I had done all this to her and her family. I looked at her in disbelief and calmly told her that I had discovered their plot against me and acted preemptively. I explained that I knew about her affair with Mike all along, and I asked why she married me if she despised me so much. I didn't mention the wired house or my spying on her emails. Amy admitted they had lost their house and cars, and even Mike had lost his house and truck. Now they were forced to live with her parents. She tried to downplay it, saying it wasn't personal and that she had initially married me to escape her family. Then, she confessed that she had found pleasure in manipulating me and enjoyed the situation with Mike. I asked why she hadn't just divorced me when she got together with Mike. She claimed that, in the beginning, it was enjoyable and that she expected to gain everything in the end. I said nothing more and returned to my room without another word. The next day, I left for Alaska, ready to enjoy a peaceful life. I left them behind to deal with the ruins I had caused in their lives. Their credit destroyed, their finances drained, their pride and reputation shattered. It was a far better option than resorting to violence. They would have to live with the constant reminder of me,